3.5 seconds. That's the number. In a new car sold in Europe right now, you get 3.5 seconds with your eyes off the road before the vehicle decides you've stopped paying attention and does something about it. Drop below about 31 miles an hour and the allowance goes up to 6 seconds. That's it. That's the whole budget. Count 3.5 seconds out loud sometime. It's roughly how long it takes to check a mirror, read a street sign, and look back. It's about how long it takes to turn your head toward the passenger seat to see whether your coffee is about to go over. But the 3.5 seconds isn't the part that interests me. Honestly, it's the least interesting part of this whole story. What interests me is what has to physically exist inside that car for it to know. I'm Ellen. I spent a long career on the engineering and analysis side of the American car business, testing vehicles, reading regulatory filings, sitting in supplier meetings where things got decided that nobody outside that room would hear about for another 4 years. Reading this kind of paperwork used to be my job. It's still what I do, just out loud now. Quick thing before we get going. I put together a field manual called What the Record Actually Says About Your Car. It walks through what your vehicle keeps, who gets handed it, and how you pull your own copy. You can download it, the link's sitting in the description. That's the whole pitch. Moving on. Now, here's what actually happened, and I want to give you the document numbers up front so you're not taking my word for any of this. The rule is European. It comes out of a piece of legislation called the General Safety Regulation, formerly Regulation 2019/2144. It's a big umbrella law that phases in a whole shelf of required safety systems over several years. Emergency braking, speed assistance, reversing detection, and a system with a mouthful of a name, Advanced Driver Distraction Warning. In the trade, everyone just says ADDW. The technical specification for it, the part that actually tells engineers what to build, landed separately in Commission Delegated Regulation 2023/2590, published in the Official Journal in November of 2023. It applied to brand new vehicle designs starting in July of 2024, and then on the 7th of July, 2026, it applied to everything. Every new passenger car and van registered in the European Union. Not a trim option, not a premium package, standard equipment, or it doesn't get sold. So if you buy a new car in Dublin or Munich or Lisbon this month, there is a camera in it that is looking at your face, not the road, your face. And the American response to this has been roughly split between people who didn't hear about it at all and people who heard about it and said, well, that's Europe. I'd like to talk you out of that second reaction. Not because Europe is coming for your truck. That's not the story, and I don't do that story. The story is about hardware and about the difference between a hardware decision and a policy decision, because those two things have completely different lifespans, and almost nobody explains that part. Let's start with the machine itself, because you should be able to explain this at dinner tonight. The camera is not a normal camera. It's near infrared. That means it sees a band of light just past what your eye can pick up. Same general idea as the little purple-black bulb on a security camera at night. Sitting next to the lens is an infrared illuminator, a small array of emitters that floods your face with light you can't see. That's why the system works in a pitch-dark cab at 2 in the morning and also works with the sun coming in over your left shoulder at rush hour. It brought its own light. It isn't relying on the sun. That infrared trick is also why it usually sees straight through sunglasses. Most tinted lenses block visible light. A lot of them are close to transparent in the near-infrared band, so the driver who figures he'll just put his shades on has, in most cases, done nothing at all. Now, what's it actually measuring? Two things, mostly, and they're simpler than you'd think. The first is head pose. Where is your skull pointed? The software finds a set of landmarks on your face, corners of the eyes, the tip of the nose, the jawline, and from how those points sit relative to each other, it computes which way your head is turned and tilted. That's basic geometry. It's been solid for years. The second is gaze, where the eyes are pointed inside the head. This is the harder one, and here's the elegant part. That infrared illuminator throws a tiny reflection onto the wet surface of your cornea. Engineers call it a glint. The glint stays roughly put as your eye rotates. Your pupil doesn't. So the system tracks the changing distance between the pupil center and that fixed little sparkle, and from that, it can compute the direction your eyes are aimed. Combine that with head pose, and you get a vector, a line pointing out of your face into the cabin. Then the car does one more thing. It takes that line and asks whether it lands inside a zone the regulation defines as the road ahead or outside it. The infotainment screen is outside it. The passenger footwell is outside it. Your phone in your lap is very much outside it. And it keeps a running clock. That's it. That's the mechanism. A line, a zone, and a stopwatch. Above, about 31 miles an hour, if that line stays outside the zone for 3.5 seconds, you get warned. Below that, 6 seconds. The whole thing switches itself on around 12 miles an hour, so it isn't nagging you in a parking lot. First warning is usually visual. Ignore it, and it escalates a chime, sometimes a buzz in the seat or the wheel. Now, here's the thing that makes this different from the connected car stories I usually cover. All of that math happens inside a chip in the car. It doesn't need a cell signal. It doesn't need the cloud. A gaze vector is a couple of numbers. Sending video anywhere would be slow, expensive, and pointless because the answer is needed in milliseconds. So the processing is local by engineering necessity, not just by law. Actually, let me back up because I skipped the most important sentence in the entire document and I don't want to bury it. The Europeans knew exactly how this would sound, so they wrote privacy language directly into the regulation. The systems have to run in what the text calls a closed loop. The regulation says the systems must not continuously record nor retain any data beyond what the safety function needs. Biometric identification is off the table. An explanatory memorandum attached to the rulemaking makes clear that the camera may use its images, but identifying who the person is forbidden. The data stays in the vehicle, it gets processed, and it goes away. I want to give the regulators genuine credit here because I think they earned some. That is not a throwaway clause. Somebody sat in a room and fought for it. A weaker version of this rule would have said nothing about retention and let each automaker sort it out in a privacy policy nobody reads. Instead, the requirement is baked into the type approval process, which means a vehicle that fails it doesn't get sold. That is a real enforcement hook, and it is a stronger one than almost anything we have on this side of the ocean. And the safety case behind it is not made up either. Visual distraction is a documented killer, not a scare statistic, an actual, boring, well-established cause of people dying at intersections. The Commission's own impact work notes that distraction is chronically undercounted after a crash for an obvious reason. After the fact, nobody can prove where the driver was looking. Nobody self-reports it. So the true number is almost certainly higher than the official one, not lower. If you told me there's a piece of hardware that could keep some meaningful number of people from drifting into a family in a crosswalk, and it costs a few dollars in a car that already has 11 cameras pointed outward, I'd have a hard time arguing against it in principle. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. So that's the Steelman, and I mean it. Here's my problem. The privacy protection and the physical hardware are made of two completely different materials. The camera is metal, glass, silicon, and a wiring harness bolted into the steering column. It has a service life of 15 or 20 years. It cannot be uninstalled by an act of parliament. It will be in that car when that car is on a used lot in Ohio in 2038. The protection is a paragraph. Paragraphs get amended. Paragraphs get exceptions carved into them for law enforcement, for insurance fraud investigations, for crash reconstruction, for fleet safety, for whatever the next reasonable sounding thing turns out to be. And the text as written doesn't set a fixed retention window in hours or minutes, and it doesn't establish an independent body that goes and audits whether any given automaker actually built the closed loop it said it built. The type approval test checks that the system warns you correctly. That's a different question from where the bytes went. I'm not saying that's the plan. I'm saying that's the capability. Those are two different things, and if you remember one sentence from this video, make it that one. Now let me show you why I'm not being paranoid, using nothing but things that have already happened. Take the event data recorder, the little module in your car people call the black box. It did not start life as a legal instrument. It started as an airbag diagnostic. Engineers needed to know whether the bag fired when it should have, so the module captured a few seconds of data around a deployment. Narrow purpose. Sensible. Nobody objected. Today, that data gets pulled in crash investigations, gets subpoenaed in civil suits, gets read by insurance adjusters with a $200 tool, same module, same few seconds of data. Entirely different job. Nobody amended the hardware. The world just found new uses for what was already sitting there. Take the license plate reader. It went in to check plates against stolen vehicle lists. A camera, a database, a hit or a no-hit. Also narrow, also sensible. It now generates a persistent record of where ordinary vehicles have been retained for months or years, depending on which agency and which vendor and which state, and it has produced a stack of litigation about exactly that drift. And take the one closest to home, because this one has a case number. In January of 2026, the Federal Trade Commission finalized an order against General Motors and OnStar. The allegation was that GM used a misleading sign-up process to enroll people in a feature called Smart Driver, collected precise location and driving behavior data, and sold it to third parties, including consumer reporting agencies, the data brokers, who feed information to insurers without people understanding they'd agreed to it. The Commission's own language called it an egregious betrayal of consumers' trust. The order bans that particular disclosure for 5 years and puts obligations on the company for 20. There was no fine. Now Smart Driver was pitched as a coaching tool. Buckle up more, brake more gently, see your score. That's the reasonable version. What the complaint describes is people finding out about it when their insurance renewal came in higher. That's the same shape 3 times over. A narrow, defensible purpose. Hardware installed to serve it. And then, later, somebody notices the hardware is already there and asks what else it could do. There's a phrase for that in engineering. Capability precedes application. The ability to do a thing shows up first. The decision about whether to do it shows up second. And it shows up in a room you'll never be in. All right, let's bring this home, because so far this is a European rule, and you drive an American road. Here's what nobody explains clearly. Automakers do not build a Europe car and an America car. They build a platform, one electrical architecture, one wiring harness, one interior module set, spread across every market where that vehicle sells. Because the whole economics of the business depends on making the same thing many times. Once a manufacturer has engineered a driver-facing infrared camera into the steering column, casting for the European version, the cost of leaving it in the American version is close to nothing. The cost of taking it out, designing a second column, a second harness, a second validation program is real money. So the hardware travels. It always travels. That's not a theory. That's just how manufacturing works. There's a second pull, too. Euro NCAP, the crash testing organization whose star ratings appear in car advertising all over the world, has been awarding points for driver monitoring since 2023, and its 2026 protocols raise the weight and widen what the system has to catch, including inferring impairment from behavior, not just fatigue. A manufacturer who wants 5 stars builds the camera in, and you do not get a separate, unrated interior for the American market. Which brings us to the part of this story that I think is actually the story. The United States has not mandated this camera. I want to be precise about that, because you'll see people online claiming otherwise, and it isn't true. What the United States has is Section 24,220 of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law passed in 2021. That section directs the Department of Transportation to issue a federal motor vehicle safety standard requiring new passenger vehicles to be equipped with advanced drunk and impaired driving prevention technology. Passive technology, meaning it works without you blowing into anything or pressing anything. The final rule was due on the 15th of November, 2024. It didn't happen. What happened instead was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, published on the 5th of January, 2024, in Volume 89 of the Federal Register, page 830. That's the stage where the agency asks questions rather than proposing text. The public filed something on the order of 18,367 comments. As of the middle of this year, the agency has still not put out a proposed rule, let alone a final one. It has filed the required report to Congress explaining the delay, and it's still taking meetings with industry. So the American situation is this. There's a law in the books telling regulators to require a system that watches you for impairment. There's no rule yet saying how, And in the meantime, the hardware capable of doing it is arriving in the country anyway, on its own schedule, driven by a European deadline and a star rating. And here is the part that I keep turning over. Europe wrote the privacy rule and the camera requirement at the same time. Imperfect rule, weak audit, no retention clock, I said all that. But it exists, and it's attached to whether the car can legally be sold. Over here, the camera shows up without the paragraph. There's no federal closed-loop requirement for cabin cameras. There's no federal rule saying a driver-facing camera's output can't leave the vehicle. What we have instead is a patchwork of state privacy laws with different scopes, a consent screen at the dealership, and an enforcement agency that just spent 2 years getting a settlement with no financial penalty attached. That's my read on it, and I could be wrong about where it goes, but I don't think I'm wrong about the shape of it. Let me put you in a room for a second. It's a Saturday. You're at a dealership, buying the first new vehicle you've bought since 2014, and the salesman is walking you through the touchscreen. He gets to a page with a couple of toggles on it and says the connected services need to be enabled for the safety features to work properly, and taps accept before you've finished reading the line above his thumb. Then he shows you the heated seats. Somewhere in the stack of documents you sign 40 minutes later is a paragraph describing what the vehicle collects. You will never read it. Nobody reads it. That's not a character flaw, that's the design. And that little dark circle on the steering column, the one you assumed was a sensor for the automatic headlights, nobody mentioned it because nobody was required to. So, what do you actually do? Because I'm not going to leave you sitting here uneasy with nothing in your hands. If you're shopping for a new vehicle, ask 4 questions before you sign anything, and ask them plainly. Does this vehicle have a driver-facing camera? Is it infrared? Can it be turned off? And does turning it off disable anything else? And where does what it sees go? Ask for the answer in writing. A salesperson's verbal reassurance is worth exactly nothing in a dispute, and most of them genuinely don't know that's not a slight against them. It's just not in the training. Second, before you sign, ask to see the Connected Services Agreement and the Privacy Notice as separate documents, and take them home if you need to. You're allowed to. What you're looking for is any language about sharing driving behavior data with third parties, affiliates, or service providers. Those 3 words are where the road forks. Third, if you already own a recent connected vehicle, go to your Automakers privacy portal. Every major one has one now. And the GM order pushed the whole industry toward building them, and request a copy of your own data. Then look at what comes back. Not what they say they collect, what actually arrives. There are also free tools where you can enter a vehicle identification number and get a report on what that model collects and shares. Privacy for Cars runs one called the Vehicle Privacy Report. It costs nothing and it takes about a minute. Fourth, and this one is the receipt I actually want you to keep. Go to regulations.gov and pull up docket NHTSA-2022-0079. That's the Impaired Driving Technology docket. Everything in it is public. The agency's questions, the comments from automakers and suppliers and safety groups, the memoranda from industry meetings. If a proposed rule for driver monitoring in American vehicles ever appears, it will appear there first, with a comment period attached, and the comment period is the only window in the entire process where an ordinary person's name goes into the record. Don't take my word for any of this. Go read the docket yourself. It's dry, and it's the real thing. Look, I'm not going to tell you the camera is coming to take your license. There's no evidence of a coordinated plan, and I'd be lying if I dressed one up for you. What there is a set of aligned incentives. Automakers who'd rather build one interior than 2. Ratings organizations rewarding the feature. Insurers who have already demonstrated, on the record, what they'll pay for behavioral data when someone's willing to sell it. And a regulator holding a statutory instruction to require passive impairment detection with no rule written yet and no deadline that anyone is enforcing. Aligned incentives don't need a plan, they just need time. The camera is not the villain here. The camera is a well-engineered answer to a real problem, and on the day it stops somebody from drifting through a red light, I'll be glad it was there. The question is, who ends up holding what it sees, and under what rule, and whether that rule was written before or after the hardware was already in 10 million dashboards. Because in my experience, the rules that get written afterward tend to describe what's already happening. Ownership and control are not the same thing. You can own every bolt in that vehicle and still not be the one who decides what it says about you. My own car is 12 years old. It has a cassette adapter in the glove box and no idea where my eyes are. I'm not replacing it anytime soon, but that's a personal preference, not advice, and eventually all of us end up on a lot signing paperwork. When that day comes, know what's in the column. Read the connected services page. Pull the docket number. Ask the 4 questions. That's not paranoia. That's just being the person in the room who read the document. If this was useful, subscribe. I read this paperwork so you don't have to, and there's more of it coming. I'll see you in the next one.